My gosh. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and since we are in London, I am going to channel my inner John Cleves and start with, and now for something completely different. There's a Chinese aphorism that says, "May you live in interesting times." It's not a blessing, it's a curse. What it speaks to is it describes a time of great uncertainty, a time of historic change, a time of upheaval. As you've seen through the discussions in this conference, ladies and gentlemen, we live in interesting times. And is being led by many of the men you see on this slide. And it's a future that may entail conflict, may entail stability, it may entail just uncertainty. And many students of history are drawing parallels between now and 1939, and that we are heading toward another global conflict. Interesting fact that if you go back and look at the centuries in the history of mankind and womankind, peace is the anomaly. War and conflict is the norm. Across thousands of years, empires have risen and fallen. Borders have been shaped by conquest, and long periods of peace have been the exception. Geopolitics creates a storm. Our job is to figure out how to navigate. All right, here's your test question. You have 1 hour to save the world. What are you going to do first? This is one of my favorite quotes, and it comes from Einstein. And it gets into, I think, a theme that I'll cover as we go through this, which is he said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend the first 55 minutes trying to find the problem, and I'd spend the last 5 minutes saving the world. And so, as you think of the discussions you've had over the last couple of days, did you come in with a problem that you thought you needed to solve? Has that problem changed? Because you're going to have to iterate. The British historian Sir Michael Howard said, the winner of the next conflict will be the nation who gets it the least incorrect. My time in the military has taught me problem definition is absolutely critical, and it's one of the first things that we do. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a meeting with a senior leader, such as when I was the intelligence officer for Central Command. I'd sit down with General Mattis, and he would start off with, all right, gentlemen, ladies, what is the problem we have to solve? And I see that in my time as a consultant for a lot of the startup tech companies. As I look at their capabilities, I say, you got to answer 3 questions for me. What's the problem we're trying to solve? How is it done today? And what are you going to do that's different, that I'm going to get a better outcome? And when you think about problem definition, think about alignment and context. Alignment and context. If the definition lacks clarity, do you have alignment with your team? If it lacks understanding, do you have alignment? Or have you even defined the correct problem? And the other part is context. It can't be something that's antiseptic, that's done in a laboratory. It has to be something that is applied in the real world. Problem definition matters. And we are living in interesting times. I would ask you to raise your hands if you've ever heard of the Thucydides trap or Thucydides, but I cannot see anybody but the front row. When I started to say we may be heading down a path going to a global conflict, in 2017, Professor Graham Allison wrote a book called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Thucydides was an Athenian general, a historian, and wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides said it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. The key word, inevitable. And so what Graham was trying to do is taking a look at the context of a rising China and a reigning U.S. to draw the analogies between Sparta and Athens. And what he wanted to do is provide lessons for those senior leaders to understand that a conflict between China and the U.S. is not inevitable. He wrote it for policymakers. What he wanted to do is give them insights. He gives 16 different use cases. All very, very different. 12 of them end in conflict, 4 of them do not. But the lessons that he wants people to take away are that fear, miscalculation, alliance entanglements, nationalism, security dilemmas are all lessons that you have to understand and you have to navigate. Interestingly enough, there was so much discussion about this when Graham's book came out, which became a national bestseller, that it even warranted, because of the amount of discussion that was coming out of the US, that Xi Jinping said, "There is no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world. But should countries time and again make the mistake of strategic miscalculation," he might have been facing Washington, D.C., "they may create such traps for themselves." He went on to say that the Thucydides trap is not inevitable. The planet Earth is vast enough to accommodate respective development and common prosperity of China and the United States. It is not inevitable. Think about globalization. How much have you talked about globalization during this conference? About resilience, about redundancy. If you went back 10 years and somebody said globalization, good or bad, probably would have got almost a universal thumbs up. Norman's premise in his book, The Great Illusion, was globalization has us so intertwined as nations that it would be futile. It would be an illusion to ever think that we would have a major conflict. Look at the small print in the middle. He wrote the book in 1910, 4 years before World War I. Anything is possible. Lord Palmerston, as I think about globalization, resiliency, the decisions of nations, this resonates with me tremendously, and it was said in 1848. Especially as a former soldier and all the time that I've spent with so many of our allies and partners. Nations don't have enduring interests, and they don't have enduring allies. They don't have enduring enemies, and they don't have enduring allies. They have enduring interests. And that's what drives decisions. And even as much as we talk about the special relationship that the United States and Britain has, one of the most consequential conflicts of the last half of the 21st century in Vietnam, Britain decided not to join the US. When the French, the Israelis, and Britain thought about nationalizing the Suez Canal in 1956, they didn't read Eisenhower on the plan early, and he was a little frustrated and chose not to support. Nations will always act in their national interests. What we look for is convergence and where they align, and that is important. The other part, when you think about the problem, because we think of things like the European Union, we think about NATO, we think about AUKUS. For those of you that have some understanding of the intelligence community, we always talk about the Five Eyes relationship, which was born out of World War II, which is the closest intel sharing relationship that we have. But that should not be your default. When you define the problem, you should be thinking not about the alignment of those nations necessarily. You should be thinking about who has equities and who could be value added in solving this problem. That's who should be under your tent. You don't always start with the team that you've been playing with through the years. May you live in interesting times. So I'm going to go back to problem definition quickly. What's been coined as the liberal world order that we've enjoyed the last 80 plus years that we all grew up in is over. It cannot be recovered. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. What we have to do is define what comes next. We are in a period of transition. As one of my former commanders said when he thought about the adversaries, is that they no longer fear us, yet they still respect us as we move ahead. So let me give you a possible problem statement. The post-Cold War liberal order is giving way to a more fragmented, transactional, and multipolar world defined by renewed great power competition, weakened global institutions, rising nationalism, economics, weaponization, contested supply chains, and rapid technological disruption, the diffusion of dual-use capabilities, military and civilian, and a global information warfare environment. Something to think about. How are you going to navigate that? As an intelligence officer, the first question I always get is, tell me how this ends. A little bit of tongue-in-cheek, I put a crystal ball in the middle. I don't have a crystal ball. What I think we have in the intelligence community is sound methodologies in terms of how we do analysis, our framework for analysis. And when we talk to leaders, we try to reduce uncertainty, and we tell them about the probability of outcomes and the confidence of our assessment, which I'm sure you get the same thing in the analysis that you do in the financial markets. And all that is based on the input that you get. The quality of my analysis and the confidence levels that I have is directly proportional to the intelligence I'm able to gather. The better the intelligence, the more likely I'm going to have some insights. Ultimately, the best intelligence is if you can get inside the inner circle and you can get inside Putin's head, inside Kim Jong-un's, the Ayatollahs, or President Xi's. And that will give you insights about what they intend, how they view us, what they fear as they're making decisions. 2 panels ago, there was a conversation about artificial intelligence, and I really wanted to touch this, and I'll do this briefly as I'm seeing the zeros click on my clock. If you've never heard the story of Stanislav Petrov and the man who saved the world, I would tell you to look that up. It is absolutely fascinating, and I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of it. He was an air defense officer for the Soviet Union, and you have the date down there, on September 26th of 1983. He's on duty, and he's on duty 3 weeks after the Soviet Union has shot down a Korean airliner that left Alaska and strayed into Soviet airspace, killed 269, to include a U.S. congressman. He's on duty. There's a new system in place that's looking for early warning for intercontinental ballistic missiles. He gets an alert. There's a missile. He gets a follow-on alert. There's 5 missiles inbound. His standard protocol is to alert his chain of command and get ready for the response. But he looks at that and he applies judgment. Judgment based on experience. And his judgment tells him if the U.S. is going to do that, they would likely send hundreds of missiles. I would see reflections from ground radar systems and other areas. I'm going to question this. And he was right. It was a false alarm, because he applied judgment. So as you think about the artificial intelligence and the efficiencies and the economies and the ability to scale and all the work you do, how are you training that next generation to build their level of expertise and their judgment so that everything they're doing is not, well, this is what I got out of ChatGPT. Geopolitics is a boardroom variable. It's something you have to watch. It will touch all of us. Globalization moved faster than geopolitics, and now there are corrections in the international order. And we will feel those for years to come. And so let me close. As we look to the future, I am an optimist for everything that I told you. I am an optimist. As Sir Michael Howard said, and I said to you earlier, success will be by those who get it the least wrong. The arc of history is rarely straight. It moved through periods of turbulence and transition before new periods of stability emerge. While the coming years will undoubtedly be challenging, I do remain optimistic that the greatest advances always emerge during times of turmoil. And what we need, to our previous speaker, are great leaders that can navigate what are really going to be uncharted waters in the coming years. And with that, thank you so much for your time.